The water came up through the garden hose looking clean. It wasn't. A thin white crust had already formed along the inside of the mason jar she'd filled straight from the wellhead, the same crust now rimming every drip line strung across 4 acres of pepper plants that were closer to dead than alive. She touched a finger to the rim, then to her tongue. Not soil. Salt. Behind her stood a half-built frame of scavenged aluminum poles and taped plastic sheeting, stapled into a shape that didn't have a name yet and looked, from the road, like a greenhouse somebody had given up on halfway through. Her neighbor had already driven past twice that morning, slowing just long enough to shake his head. The woman kneeling in the dirt was Elena Vasquez. She had 11 weeks left before the bank took the land her father was buried under.
Based on real history, dramatized for storytelling, the water crisis, the greenhouse science, and the underlying agricultural history in this video are real and documented. Elena Vasquez, the people around her, and the specific events of this story are fictionalized, built on top of that real foundation. We'll tell you exactly where the line sits at the end.
Wherever you're watching this from tonight, drop it in the comments below. We read every one. And if this is the kind of story you want more of, this is a fair place to hit subscribe, so the next one finds you. Thermal, California. Coachella Valley. August 1986. The Vasquez place was 11 acres of sandy loam her father, Ignacio, had bought in 1961 from a Dutch-born engineer named Cornelis Bakker, who'd come to the valley a decade earlier to help design canal turnouts, and stayed to grow peppers nobody thought would take root in that heat. Bakker had died in 1974. Ignacio had died 3 years ago, of a heart that gave out the same week the well report came back with numbers nobody wanted to say out loud. The valley had been drinking Colorado River water since the Coachella Canal opened in 1948, but the Vasquez parcel sat on the far eastern edge, past where the canal's laterals reached, still pulling from a well that had been sunk in the 1950s. For 30 years that well had been generous. Now the aquifer under it was drawing in the salts that collected at the basin's low end, and every season the water came up a little harder on the crop. Elena had inherited the land, the debt, and a bank loan Ignacio had taken against a wet year that never repeated. Warren Holt, the loan officer at Valley AG Trust, had been polite about it in the way people are polite right before they take something from you. He told her, more than once, that the bank didn't want the land. They wanted the payments. Either was fine by the paperwork. Dale Pruitt farmed the parcel next door, dates mostly, and had known Ignacio for 30 years. He liked Elena fine. He thought the plastic frame going up behind her house was a woman grieving in the shape of a construction project, and he said so, not unkindly, at the feed store, in front of 3 other men who laughed the way men laugh when they've already decided something is settled. What none of them knew, what Elena herself hadn't fully understood until 3 weeks earlier, was that Ignacio had kept a locked toolbox in the shed for 25 years, and inside it was a water-stained notebook, half in Dutch, half in English, filled with Cornelis Bakker's handwriting and a single hand-drawn diagram Elena couldn't make sense of. A greenhouse roof. Gutters running the wrong way. Notes in the margins about grams of water per square meter, about something Bakker had called the closed house, and a line underlined twice, that Ignacio had translated in pencil beside it. The plant gives back almost as much as it drinks, if you stop letting it escape. Ignacio had never used it. He'd kept it in the box instead, the way people keep things they don't understand but aren't ready to throw away. The obstacle in front of Elena wasn't only the well. It was the calendar. Warren Holt needed a production number by the end of September that her Saltburn peppers were never going to hit, and no bank in the valley was going to lend against a notebook. The first month was the kind of work nobody films. Elena drove to a glass supply outfit in Indio and bought what she could afford, which was almost nothing. Used greenhouse panels. A citrus operation was junking. A roll of vapor barrier plastic meant for a different job entirely. Sheet aluminum bent into gutter shapes on her father's old workbench. She read Bakker's notebook by lamplight after 12-hour days, translating the Dutch phrases one at a time with a paperback dictionary from the Indio library, getting maybe 2 sentences right for every 10 she guessed at. Dale Pruitt's mockery cooled into something closer to worry. He didn't help. But he stopped joking about it in front of the other men. Nella Ochoa, who ran produce intake at the thermal packing shed, gave Elena the first small win without meaning to. She tasted one of the peppers Elena had managed to keep alive under a torn corner of shade cloth, smaller than usual, but sweet in a way the salt-stressed ones from the open rows weren't, and asked, quietly, if Elena had any more like it. It wasn't a sale. It was 3 pounds. But it was the first time in a year someone had wanted what Elena was growing instead of pitying it. A second win came from a stranger. A retired agricultural extension agent from Riverside, passing through on his way to a date festival, stopped at the fence to ask what the frame was going to be. He didn't laugh. He said the shape reminded him of something he'd read about out of the Netherlands, some sealed-up growing house that barely needed watering. He didn't know the details. But he said the word, Dutch, and something in Elena's chest went still, because that was the word already sitting in the notebook on her kitchen table. The private low point came on a Tuesday night in early September, 3 weeks before the bank's deadline. A dust storm had torn a full panel of plastic sheeting off the frame, undoing 4 days of work in under an hour. Elena sat on the back steps in the dark with the ruined sheeting in her lap and Bakker's notebook open beside her, and for the first time since her father's funeral, she let herself consider selling. Not because the idea in the notebook felt wrong. Because she was one woman, on 11 acres, with a dictionary and a dead man's diagram, and the water kept getting salter no matter how carefully she read. She didn't sell. She went back inside, found a dry page, and started translating again. What Elena didn't know, what nobody in the valley had reason to know in 1986, was that Cornelis Bakker's diagram wasn't a curiosity. It was 2 decades ahead of formal science. Researchers at Wageningen University in the Netherlands would not publish rigorous field trials on the closed greenhouse concept until the 2000s, but when they did, the numbers matched almost exactly what Bakker had scrawled in the margins of Elena's kitchen table notebook. A sealed structure that recovers water the crop itself breathes back into the air, condensing on cooled surfaces instead of venting it outside, cutting outside water demand by roughly half. The reason it hadn't worked in 1986 at first was that Elena had built the frame using Bakker's rough diagram but had left 2 vents open along the ridge line out of habit. Every greenhouse she'd ever seen vented that way. The heat wasn't the enemy. The open air was. Bakker's notebook, on its second-to-last page, said as much in a line she'd read a dozen times without understanding it. Seal it, or it forgives you nothing. She found the line again the week after the dust storm, this time with a fresh eye and a decent Dutch dictionary translation from a librarian in Palm Springs who'd once studied the language. Seal it or it forgives you nothing. She understood it that night the way you understand a joke 20 minutes too late, all at once. And a little embarrassed it had taken so long, she sealed the vents. She hung a curtain of black plastic sheeting where the sun hit hardest at midday, an early version of what Bakker's notes called an energy screen, and she ran a length of cool well water, salty, but cold, through the aluminum gutters lining the underside of the roof. The plants, sealed into their own small climate, breathed moisture into the air all day. At night, when the desert temperature dropped hard and the gutters ran colder than the air around them, that moisture gave itself back, bead by bead, running down into a collection trough Elena had built from a broken irrigation pipe. The first morning she found actual water pooled in that trough. Not much, maybe 4 gallons. She didn't call anyone. She just stood there for a long time, looking at water her plants had made themselves. Warren Holt drove out 10 days before the deadline, expecting to deliver bad news in person because that was the kind of man he was. He found Elena weighing a crate of peppers that were, for the first time all season, uniform, unblemished, and sized like peppers from a wetter climate than this one. He didn't apologize for the pressure he'd put on her. He asked, instead, what the collection trough under the roofline was for. Elena told him. He wrote nothing down, which for a loan officer was its own kind of surrender, and he gave her 90 more days without being asked twice. Dale Pruitt showed up the following Saturday, unannounced, and without a word started helping her run the second bay of gutters, the ones Elena hadn't had time to finish alone. the final piece of the story arrived by mail, not in the field. A woman named Greet Bakker wrote to Elena from Rotterdam, having heard through a cousin in India that someone in the Coachella Valley was asking around about a Dutch engineer named Cornelis Bakker. She was his niece. She enclosed a photograph and a short letter, translated by her own hand, explaining that her uncle had taken the Coachella Canal engineering job partly because it was work, and partly because it gave him a legitimate reason to leave. His early sealed greenhouse experiments had been dismissed by a horticultural cooperative back home as impractical. A waste of covered acreage in a country that already had cheap glass and cheap gray skies. He'd come to the desert, the letter said, because it was the one place hot and dry enough to prove he was right, and the one place too poor and too skeptical to let him. He never got the chance to finish proving it. After the canal work wound down, he bought a small plot of his own to keep experimenting on the side, sold Ignacio the parcel with the notebook in 1961 when he needed the money, and kept working nights and weekends on a second, smaller version of the same design until his heart gave out in 1974, the greenhouse behind that second plot still half built. Ignacio Vasquez had bought the first plot, and the notebook with it, without ever knowing what either one was, by late October. 4 bays of Elena's converted greenhouse were producing peppers and tomatoes at yields the Saltburn open rows hadn't managed in 3 years, on roughly half the water the old drip system had used. The valley didn't throw her a parade. Word moved the way it does in farm country, slowly, through the packing shed, through Nella Ochoa telling a buyer from a Palm Desert restaurant, through Dale Pruitt mentioning it at the feed store without a trace of the old joke in his voice. Elena kept Bakker's notebook on the same kitchen table where she'd first opened it, and on its last blank page, she added her own line, in English this time, for whoever found it next. The desert didn't need less faith in it. It needed a roof that knew how to keep a secret.
If you've made it this far, you already know where you're watching from. Go ahead and drop it in the comments. And if a story like this one is worth passing to somebody else who'd sit through all 12 minutes, that's the best thing you could do for this channel today. Thank you.